After my wife asked for a break, she came back in tears with flowers, so I just smiled and asked, "Did your ex dump you after sleeping with you?" Her reaction confirmed everything. 3 weeks had passed since Gabrielle walked out of our Charlotte home, claiming she needed space to grow as a person and figure out who she really was outside of our marriage that had apparently become too confining for her expanding horizons. I was in the kitchen that Saturday afternoon, sleeves rolled up and hands deep in the sink cabinet, trying to fix our garbage disposal that had been making grinding noises for weeks while she was gone, when desperate knocking interrupted my methodical work on what should have been a peaceful weekend. Through the peephole, I saw her standing on our front porch with wilted supermarket roses clutched in one trembling hand and mascara streaking down her cheeks in dark rivers that told a story of recent tears and carefully applied makeup that hadn't survived whatever conversation had brought her back to my doorstep with her tail between her legs. I'd found genuine peace in these 3 weeks, settling into a comfortable routine of early morning work calls handling network installations across the Southeast, evening swims at the community pool where nobody knew my business or asked awkward questions about my missing wife, and quiet dinners with my college friend Ian who'd been checking on me regularly without making it feel like charity or pity from someone who felt sorry for the abandoned husband. The house felt different without her constant critiques about my cooking, my clothes, my weekend plans that never seemed exciting enough for someone with her refined tastes and social aspirations that had grown more demanding and expensive each year of our marriage. "Daniel, please, I desperately need to talk to you," she said the moment I opened the door, her voice cracking with a desperation I'd never heard before in our 8 years of marriage, not even during her father's funeral or the miscarriage 2 years ago that had supposedly brought us closer together. "We're soulmates. We belong together. I made such a terrible mistake and I can't live without you. I see that now so clearly and I'm begging you to forgive me." I leaned against the doorframe, studying her face with the same analytical approach I used for troubleshooting complex telecommunications systems at work, noting the way her eyes darted around as if looking for the right words to manipulate the situation back in her favor while her hands shook with what might have been withdrawal from whatever fantasy she'd been living for the past 3 weeks. "Did Tyler Stevens dump you after he got what he wanted?" I asked calmly, watching her expression shift from practiced hope to genuine horror in real time, her face going pale beneath the streaked makeup as the reality of my question sank in. The cheap roses hit the concrete with a soft thud as she collapsed against the side of the house, her perfectly manicured facade crumbling as completely as the petals scattering across our walkway, confirming everything I'd suspected about her sudden need for personal growth and the real reason behind her dramatic departure 3 weeks earlier when she'd packed 2 suitcases and driven away without looking back. Our neighbors across the street, the Hendersons, were pretending to tend their garden while obviously watching the drama unfold with the fascination people reserve for car accidents and public breakdowns, and I realized this was probably exactly the kind of public scene Gabrielle had hoped to avoid by conducting her midlife crisis more discreetly. I stepped back into the house, leaving the door open behind me as she followed with shaking legs, and calmly explained that I discovered her secret communications with Tyler Stevens through her forgotten laptop 3 weeks prior, the same laptop she'd left open on our kitchen counter the morning before she announced her need for space. Gabrielle collapsed onto our living room couch, the same spot where she'd delivered her rehearsed speech about needing to find herself, and through broken sobs admitted she'd questioned whether she'd married the wrong person after reconnecting with Tyler through their high school reunion planning committee on Facebook. "He convinced me he was unhappy in his engagement and still loved me after all these years," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she stared at her hands. "He said his fiancée didn't understand him the way I always had, that we were meant to be together and he'd made a mistake choosing someone else back then. Their reunion had seemed magical at first," she continued, "with expensive dinners at upscale restaurants I could never afford on my telecommunications salary, late-night phone conversations that lasted until dawn where they reminisced about their teenage romance, and promises of the glamorous life they should have had together if circumstances hadn't separated them after graduation. Tyler had painted pictures of their future that included travel to Europe, a house in the mountains, and freedom from the mundane responsibilities that had apparently made our marriage feel like a prison to her restless spirit. He made me feel young again, like I was the girl he'd loved in high school instead of the woman who'd settled for a boring life with a boring husband," she said, the words cutting deeper than she probably intended. However, after their intimate encounter at his downtown hotel 3 nights ago, the same hotel where he'd been telling his fiancée he was attending business conferences, Tyler had become distant and cold, responding to her desperate texts with increasingly shorter messages until he finally chose his fiancée when confronted with an ultimatum. He said I was a fun distraction, but he couldn't throw away his real future for a nostalgia trip, she sobbed, finally looking up at me with eyes that held genuine devastation. He called our entire relationship a nostalgia trip. Daniel, like those 8 years we spent together meant nothing more than a high school fling that got out of hand. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one she'd always complained was too ugly for our living room, and watched her fall apart with the same detached curiosity I might observe a complicated system failure at work. So, he got what he wanted and disappeared, I said, more statement than question, watching her nod miserably while mascara continued its slow journey down her cheeks. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd thrown away our marriage for someone who saw her exactly the way she'd been treating me for years, as a convenient option rather than a cherished partner, and I realized this was probably the first time in her adult life that someone had made her feel disposable. Despite Gabrielle's desperate pleas that our house was still her home and our 8-year marriage should count for something more than a mistake she could simply apologize away, I calmly informed her that I'd already retained attorney Patricia Caldwell and filed dissolution papers the day after I discovered her laptop conversations, which meant this scene was essentially just ceremony at this point. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising to that pitch she used when the grocery store was out of her favorite organic yogurt. "This is our home, our life together. You can't just throw it all away because I made one mistake." I watched her cycle through the stages of realization, her face shifting from disbelief to anger to bargaining as she understood this wasn't anger speaking but genuine finality, the same way I'd approach decommissioning a failed network that couldn't be salvaged no matter how much time or money you threw at it. 8 years, Daniel, 8 years of marriage, and you're going to let one moment of weakness destroy everything we built together? She continued, reaching for my hands across the coffee table while I kept them folded calmly in my lap. I explained how her betrayal had taught me the difference between love and habit, between being someone's choice and being their backup plan, and how I'd spent the last 3 weeks discovering what it felt like to live without constantly wondering if I was enough for someone who'd clearly been settling for me all along. Her promises to change and attend counseling and never speak to Tyler again fell flat as I maintained my composure, pointing out that she'd made calculated choices rather than impulsive mistakes, choosing to download a texting app to hide their conversations, lying about working late while meeting him for dinner, and packing bags with her best lingerie for what she'd claimed was a solo retreat to find herself. Those weren't mistakes, Gabrielle. Those were deliberate decisions made by someone who'd already checked out of our marriage, I said, watching her face crumple as the reality of consequences finally hit someone who'd apparently expected forgiveness to be as automatic as my paycheck deposits. She threatened to involve our mutual friends, to tell them I was being unreasonable and refusing to work on our marriage, but I reminded her that most of them had probably already figured out why she'd suddenly needed space and would likely have their own opinions about her choices. "You're being cruel," she sobbed. "This isn't the man I married. You're cold and calculating and you don't even care that I'm falling apart here." I told her she was right, that the man she'd married would have begged her to stay, would have blamed himself for not being exciting enough, would have spent months in counseling trying to win back someone who'd already made her choice. "But that man was a fool who didn't understand his own worth," I continued, "and I'm not going to be him anymore just to make your guilty conscience feel better about the mess you created." When she finally gathered her scattered dignity and retreated to her sister's apartment across town, I returned to my garbage disposal repair with steady hands and a clear conscience, the mechanical problem somehow seeming much simpler to solve than the human one that had just walked out of my life for the second and final time. Over the following weeks, I transformed our spare bedroom into my personal sanctuary, finally setting up the vintage record collection and photography equipment that Gabrielle had banished to storage because they didn't match her vision of sophisticated adult living, and I rediscovered the simple pleasure of listening to Miles Davis while developing black and white photographs in my makeshift darkroom. I joined Ian's Wednesday night bowling league at Sunset Lanes, where a group of guys in their 30s and 40s accepted me without judgment or agenda, just grateful to have someone who could actually keep score and didn't mind buying a round when his team won. The conversations revolved around sports, work frustrations, and weekend projects rather than relationship drama, and I found genuine camaraderie with people who valued reliability over excitement and appreciated someone who showed up consistently rather than sporadically with grand gestures. Meanwhile, Gabrielle launched a social media campaign portraying herself as a woman who'd learned hard lessons about appreciating what you have and grown so much through adversity, garnering sympathy from mutual acquaintances who didn't know the full story and posting inspirational quotes about second chances and forgiveness that were clearly directed at me. Her Instagram transformed into a carefully curated narrative of personal growth and redemption, featuring photos of sunsets with captions about new beginnings, coffee cups with quotes about learning from mistakes, and yoga poses with philosophical musings about becoming your authentic self. I blocked her on all platforms after the third passive-aggressive post about how some people would rather hold grudges than heal together, deciding that her public therapy session wasn't something I needed to witness or validate with my attention. My family rallied around me in ways that surprised me, with my sister Emma being particularly vocal about how much happier I seemed without constantly walking on eggshells around Gabrielle's mood swings and unpredictable demands for attention. "I never said anything before because it wasn't my place," Emma told me during our weekly phone call, "but watching you two together was exhausting even as an observer, like you were always trying to anticipate what might set her off or disappoint her next." My parents, who'd always been polite but reserved around Gabrielle, suddenly became more talkative during our Sunday dinners, asking about my photography hobby and expressing genuine interest in my work projects for the first time in years. Ian noticed the change too, commenting that I'd stopped apologizing for taking up space in conversations or second-guessing every decision like I was expecting someone to tell me I was wrong. "You're like a different person," he said one evening after we'd finished 3 games and were sharing nachos at the bar. "More relaxed, more yourself, like you're not performing anymore." The house felt different too, quieter but not lonely, organized according to my preferences rather than someone else's aesthetic standards, filled with music I actually enjoyed and books I could read without commentary about wasting time on frivolous entertainment instead of networking or improving myself professionally. The unexpected twist came when I learned through Ian, who'd heard it from his cousin who worked at the same marketing firm as Tyler, that the football captain had actually been pursuing multiple high school classmates simultaneously, with Gabrielle being just one of several married women he'd manipulated with the same engagement doubts, story, and promises of rekindled romance. This revelation, rather than providing the satisfaction I might have expected, simply reinforced my decision as I realized how thoroughly I'd been living someone else's version of happiness for the better part of a decade, constantly adjusting myself to fit into a relationship that had never been built on genuine compatibility. I started taking Tuesday evening art classes at the community college, something I'd mentioned interest in years ago only to have Gabrielle dismiss it as impractical and time-consuming, and discovered I had a decent eye for composition and color theory that my photography hobby had apparently been preparing me for all along. Weekend trips with my 12-year-old nephew Marcus became a regular thing, exploring hiking trails around the Blue Ridge Mountains and teaching him basic camera techniques while he peppered me with questions about everything from cloud formations to why adults made relationships so complicated. "Uncle Daniel, you seem way more fun than you used to be," Marcus observed during one of our Saturday adventures, "like you're not worried about getting in trouble for having a good time." The kid had accidentally nailed something I hadn't fully articulated to myself, that I'd been living in a constant state of low-level anxiety about whether my choices, interests, or even personality might somehow displease someone whose approval had become more important than my own satisfaction. When Gabrielle's friend Melissa attempted to play messenger, showing up at my office with guilt-laden texts about Gabrielle's complete devastation and how I was destroying someone who truly loved me but just made one terrible mistake, I blocked her number and focused on planning a solo photography trip to Asheville that I'd been researching during lunch breaks. "She's barely eating, barely sleeping, and she keeps saying you were the best thing that ever happened to her," Melissa had pleaded, apparently expecting this information to melt my resolve and send me running back to comfort someone who'd discarded our marriage like an outdated phone plan. I explained to Melissa that Gabrielle's emotional state wasn't my responsibility anymore, that she'd made adult choices and could handle adult consequences, and that someone who truly valued what we had wouldn't have risked it all for the fantasy of a more exciting alternative. The photography trip to Asheville became a symbol of reclaimed independence, 3 days of exploring mountain vistas and small-town architecture without having to justify my schedule or defend my creative interests to someone who saw hobbies as childish distractions from the serious business of social advancement and financial optimization. At the courthouse 4 weeks later, Judge Williams dissolved our marriage in 12 minutes of standard questions and paperwork review, the legal formality feeling almost anticlimactic after months of emotional turbulence that had preceded this moment of bureaucratic efficiency. Gabrielle sat with her attorney at the opposite table, dressed in a conservative navy suit that was probably meant to convey respectability and remorse, occasionally glancing in my direction with what looked like hope that I might change my mind at the last possible moment. When the judge asked if there were any objections to the dissolution, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before he stamped the final papers and declared our marriage officially terminated, the sound of that stamp carrying more finality than all the arguments and tears that had brought us to this sterile courtroom. Outside in the parking lot, Gabrielle made one final appeal, claiming she was completely changed and understood real love now after losing the best thing that ever happened to her, but I simply wished her well with someone who wanted to be her practice round rather than her life partner. "You're really going to walk away from 8 years like they meant nothing?" she asked, her voice carrying that familiar edge of manipulation disguised as wounded innocence that I'd learned to recognize over the past few months. "Those 8 years taught me what I don't want in a relationship," I replied calmly, "and more importantly, they taught me what I deserve, which isn't someone who sees me as a consolation prize or backup plan." The unexpected moment came when Tyler himself appeared in the parking lot, apparently hoping to explain his side to me and perhaps clear his conscience about the destruction he'd caused, only to retreat quickly when faced with my calm indifference rather than the confrontation he'd probably expected. "Look, man, I never meant for things to go so far," he started, his voice carrying the kind of practiced sincerity that probably worked on impressionable teenagers but fell flat on someone who'd spent years analyzing failed systems and identifying their root causes. "You didn't mean to pursue a married woman, convince her to leave her husband, sleep with her, and then abandon her when things got complicated?" I asked, watching him struggle to find words that would make his behavior sound less calculated than it obviously was. He mumbled something about not realizing how serious she was about leaving me and backed toward his car when he understood that I wasn't going to provide him with absolution or engage in the dramatic confrontation that might have made him feel better about his choices. That evening, celebrating with Ian and our bowling team at Sullivan's Steakhouse, I felt only relief and anticipation for whatever came next. The weight of pretending to be someone I wasn't finally lifted from my shoulders after years of careful performance designed to maintain peace in a relationship that had required me to minimize myself. 6 months later, I'd been promoted to senior project manager at the telecommunications company and moved to a modern townhouse closer to downtown Charlotte. Complete with a spare bedroom, I converted into a proper darkroom for my photography hobby that had evolved from casual interest into something approaching genuine artistic pursuit. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and the respect of colleagues who'd apparently noticed my improved focus and confidence since my personal life had stabilized, though I'd never discussed the divorce at work beyond the basic facts when asked about my changed emergency contact information. My new place reflected my actual preferences rather than compromises made for someone else's vision of sophisticated living, with comfortable furniture I'd chosen myself, walls displaying my best landscape photographs, and a kitchen organized for someone who actually enjoyed cooking without criticism or suggestions for improvement. The twist that completed my understanding of the situation came when Emma called to tell me that Gabrielle had moved to another state, apparently having learned nothing from her experience as she was already engaged to someone else she'd met during her healing journey at a wellness retreat designed for people recovering from relationship trauma. She posted the ring on Instagram with some caption about finding her true soulmate. Emma reported with obvious disgust. "Apparently this guy owns a yoga studio and believes in past life connections or something equally ridiculous." I felt only mild curiosity about this development, the same way I might wonder about the current weather in a city I'd once visited but had no plans to return to, and realized that someone who could move from devastating heartbreak to eternal love in 6 months had probably never experienced either emotion authentically. My life now included regular weekend photography expeditions with Marcus, who developed his own eye for composition and had started entering his pictures in local youth competitions, and the quiet satisfaction of making decisions based solely on my own values and interests rather than someone else's expectations or approval. The bowling league had become more than just Wednesday night entertainment, evolving into genuine friendships with men who valued consistency over excitement and appreciated someone who contributed to the group dynamic without needing to be the center of attention or create drama to feel important. Ian often commented on how different I seemed, more relaxed in my own skin and confident in ways that had nothing to do with external validation, and I'd begun to understand that the person I'd been in my marriage wasn't actually me but rather a carefully constructed character designed to avoid conflict and maintain harmony with someone whose needs had somehow become more important than my own sense of self. My final reflection, as I sat in my darkroom developing photographs from a recent solo trip to the mountains, centered not on what I'd lost but on how losing someone who didn't truly value me had ultimately led me to rediscover who I actually was beneath years of compromise and accommodation that had gradually eroded my authentic personality until I'd almost forgotten what my own preferences and dreams looked like.